Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Climate Now Live, asking how emissions are monitored. My name is Jeremy Wilkes, science reporter at Euronews. I present the regular monthly Climate Now programme. And in this discussion, we're talking about emissions, how they get into the atmosphere, how they're absorbed back by the planet. In fact, it's a very calculated, a difficult to calculate thing. It is incredibly complicated to work out actually where emissions are coming from exactly, how they're absorbed back by trees, by the ocean, etc. There are many questions around this. It sounds like it should be relatively simple, but it isn't at all. So let me welcome our guests here who are going to help us to understand some of the problems, some of the gaps in our knowledge, and some of the areas where we're making progress in getting a better handle on emissions. Let me welcome Richard Englund, the Deputy Director of the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. Hi, Richard.
Good morning, Jeremy. Happy to be on the program today.
Thanks for being there. I'd also like to welcome Bram Massackers, Senior Scientist at SRON, the Netherlands Institute for Space Research. Hi, Bram. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And Oksana Tarasova, Senior Scientific Officer at the World Meteorological Organization, joining us all the way from South Korea. Hi, Oksana.
Hello.
It's about 6 o'clock in the evening, so thanks for joining us at the end of your hard-working day. And Amir Sokolovsky, the Global Director for Climate at CDP. Hi, Amir, you're in London, I believe. Thanks very much for being with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, Richard, quickly, what's the biggest outstanding question at the moment related to emissions? What do we not know? What do we know well?
Well, I would start with our commitment as part of the overall Paris Agreement, this big agreement between countries to reduce climate change. So the goal is to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees, or even better, if we can, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to really monitor this, we can monitor the temperatures, but actually what is driving this temperature change are concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, CO2, methane, and others. And what's driving those concentrations are the emissions, and that's actually the part we can control. So having detailed monitoring of these emissions is key in the coming years to really mitigate climate change as much as we can.
Yeah, and there are a lot of questions about that, particularly related to the role of nature and how that's evolved. Oksana, which is the most difficult, really, the kind of industrial emissions or the role of nature? Which is the most difficult to measure and quantify?
I think that the fossil fuel emissions, which are coming from fossil fuel combustion, is probably one of the easiest things to quantify. We have good accounting for how much fossil fuels being burned. But everything else, which is related to, let's say, even the anthropogenic emissions related to the natural processes, for example, if you try to characterize agricultural emissions, which are distributed and respond to climate change, they will be difficult. But when it comes to the natural emissions and uptakes, this is probably one of the most difficult to quantify.
And then, Amir, can I come over to you? Why does this all matter, actually? Why do we need to know?
So thank you. I'll be the slight outlier, and I don't come from a science background, but legal. For us, the biggest complication, the reason we need to know is we can identify what the emissions are, we can identify what the problem is, but who's accountable for them? Who is meant to solve them is incredibly important in that next step. So we can identify where emissions are on a map or on a satellite, but we have to make, as a social decision, an accountability measure, i.e. those emissions are yours to take care of. Whether they're yours emitted or not is a different question. I agree completely with Oksana that accounting for CO2 or CO2 equivalent, while not easy, is the easiest part. The next part is also nature, where your actions will not have repercussions that can be measured usually for a few years, and yet we have to enforce action. So it's important to know so that action becomes enforceable.
It's that element of responsibility is just going to grow and grow and grow in conversations. Obviously, that's going to be coming up at COP29 in Azerbaijan. And we know we've also got the biodiversity COP underway this week as well in Colombia. Let me come over to Bram. You're looking at solutions. Are there solutions to improve our ability to monitor emissions?
Absolutely. I think we are seeing that our observations to get at emissions are getting better and better. And especially the last couple of years, we've really seen a revolution of what we can do from space. Also providing now actionable data, really pointing at where, for example, methane leaks are.
We're going to get into some of the detail about how that's done as well, and I'm looking forward to you explaining that. But I just want to look at the kind of situation as it is today. Where are we in 2024? And if we bring up the first graphic that we have, it shows that basically 2024 is online to become the warmest year on record after 2023 was the warmest year on record. Richard, when you look at that, what's your first reaction?
I'm deeply worried. This is really temperature changes as I haven't seen before, and it keeps going up. It's not a total surprise, of course, but it's deeply worrying. We can't do as a global community more to really avoid this and make sure we don't have to deal with the consequences of these temperature rises.
I mean, as a journalist, we're taught to avoid repeating words all of the time, but I keep saying the word warmest over and over again every month in Climate Now. And what do we see at the moment was that actually expected, Oksana? Or is this, 2024 is warmer than 2023, which is warmer than 2022, which is warmer than 2020 or whatever? Was that expected?
Well, if you look at the trend with emissions, and emissions are increasing every year, and as Richard said, when we put emissions in the atmosphere, they accumulate. You just have higher and higher concentration. You would expect a higher impact on the atmosphere. And as we discuss, as multiple factors we have big phenomena like El Nino and La Nina, which actually control the interactions between the biosphere and the atmosphere. That may also have played a role, but there are many unknowns in the climate system which we cannot explain with our current models.
Yeah. And when it comes to the monitoring that we're doing at the moment, I'm guessing we're getting better and better at it. Can you just give us a bit of a breakdown on the situation today? How is it done? You're from the World Meteorological Organization. How is it done at the moment? Is there little devices all around the globe that are measuring emissions? How does it work?
Well, actually, we are not measuring emissions all around the globe. And the current situation is there are member countries who are the parties to Paris Agreement and who have obligations to actually report their emissions. And that is done using the approach where this is a standardized approach, actually, which is prescribed by the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, where countries collect the data on the activities and then they multiply by emission factors. If it is an advanced country, they have the emission factors which are adjusted to the country. If it is developing countries, oftentimes they use default emission factors. They multiply activity.
What's an emission factor? What does that mean?
Emission factor, it's kind of a coefficient which is used to describe how much gas is emitted through the specific activity. For example, if you burn 1 ton of oil, then you have an emission factor which is related to this process. If you burn 1 ton of gas, then there is an emission factor which says like per ton of gas, you have so many tons of CO2, methane, and other stuff which is emitted in the atmosphere. So that is an emission factor.
That's quite accurate. I'm guessing that's quite. We when you do a calculation based on that, surely the numbers are pretty sure, aren't they?
I would not be so sure, especially when it comes to the processes. Like you can estimate emission factors pretty good if you can burn something in the lab, but if you have, for example, the rice paddy. Okay, let's imagine you have a rice paddy, and then for your rice paddy, you have a static emission factor, which means that this is a prescribed emission factor per square area, like per square meter per second. And then it does not take into consideration what is the temperature of your rice paddy. It also has very limited information about the organic material, the soil. So for some emission calculation, the uncertainty can be up to 100% or even higher. So then you put them all together, and this is what you do as a reporting.
Richard, it sounds a bit like we're sort of doing some pretty vague maths here. Actually, we haven't really got any good numbers to base our calculations on.
Well, yes and no. I don't think it's fake. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge going into these emission factors, and also important to realize is that this is done in a globally agreed way. So all the reporting of countries, as they currently do, is guided by guidelines from the IPCC, which have been agreed throughout the global community, and it's based on science as much as possible. I think one of the elements in the global reporting or in the reporting by countries is that they have to do this for the whole country as a total, and also they can report annually. So that removes quite a bit of the uncertainty to some extent. So you know the total fuel, for instance, being used throughout a year, and you apply these emission factors. And then again,
where would you say the big gaps are then? Where would you say the big gaps are?
Well, the big gaps are that there are more and less accurate emission factors. Depends on the process. If, for instance, we go to anthropogenic emissions from forests, from agriculture, then the emission factors are much, much larger than, for instance, purely fossil fuel emissions in developed countries. So it varies quite a bit. And that's actually where we can gain by bringing other information than just purely the reporting as it is currently done.
Can I bring in Bram? You're in the Netherlands, which is a place full of intensive agriculture as well, and also a small country where it should be possible to quantify these things. Has the Netherlands got decent numbers on its emissions, for example?
So I think for my work specifically, we always take more of a global perspective. So in the Netherlands, I think most emissions are relatively well characterized, but there are always emissions that are harder to capture in these, what we call bottom-up methods, where you're trying to do this activity factor and an emission factor. When you think about methane, which is what we really focus on, it often doesn't relate to combustion, but it relates to leaks. So, the natural gas that we use mainly consists of methane. Anywhere between the production of that gas and the use, if there are leakages, they will cause emissions. It's important to try to capture those using those bottom-up methods, but it's also hard to be fully complete in capturing those emissions because you have to account for every leak. So I agree with Richard that that is an element where we can really add with observations.
CDP's ranking cities, companies on their emissions. How on earth can you manage to build up a decent picture on this when there are so many uncertainties, or that it seems like it's kind of shifting sands as well because of the role of nature as well?
So first of all, just to clarify, we don't rank, we score, and we score in the transparency of the reporting around climate. It's important because of exactly the second question you asked. And I'll take half a step back. The scientific discussion talks about how much emissions there are and where they come from. It doesn't talk about the social question of attribution and responsibility. So scientific, I'll try and be as straightforward as I can. There's a question of what's the cause of a problem, and science provides that. And then there's a question of responsibility for, let's say, if it's CO2 emission or CO2 equivalent emissions. Scientific data will help determine where responsibility comes from. It is, for better or for worse, a social decision to attribute accountability for those emissions. And I'll get to how that relates to nature as well. In essence, we have decided that there are three scopes. There's scope 1, which is your direct emissions, scope 2, which is the energy that you consume, and the differentiation between them is important because the assumption is that a corporate, for example, is not completely or not wholly or not always responsible for its scope 2. So it's just what it decides to use as opposed to what it produces and how. And then it's scope 3. So it's all of the emissions of its suppliers and all of the emissions downstream, so the use of its product. That's a social decision. one I agree with. Just before we problematize it, I'm not going against it. I think it's brilliant. But the point of it is to say, we have decided that the deep pockets in the middle, the buyers, the bigger part of our corporates, they're going to be in charge of the upstream and the downstream as well, with the risk of creating a very positive, in my opinion, double counting. The accuracy of the data is incredibly important, but the way that reporting through CDP happens is more around the actions that they take. I think science sandwiches us. It gives us what a fair share is, how much emissions and what actions they should take. And then later on, it checks the impact in a sort of iterative process of the actions that have already been done. So to that extent, science is obviously, to every extent, science is incredibly important and vital. But the Paris Agreement method based itself on nationally determined contributions, and 70 to 90%, depending on which research you look into, of emissions are controlled directly by private corporates and corporations, or subnationally by cities, states, and regions, significantly more than the national organism. Therefore, it's that social decision and the precision around it that will have a huge impact on where we go. Therefore, the scoring of the transparency, what CDP does in that essence, which is very different to what scientific scoring is or the scientific measurements are, says science has told us you need to take these actions. I want to show me which actions you're taking. And then just before I relinquish the stage for a second, science also says, here is your fair share of what you can do, because no single company in the world can ensure a 1.5 future. Here is the fair share of what you can do. Here are the actions of what you can and can't do. But it is up to us to create a comparison within their sector. And this is what we very much do. You can't ask a person to grow wings and fly, and therefore there is this mixture of that's impossible because change is impossible. And we can look at science and say a comparison between this sector is very possible because they are doing that and look what they're doing. But it remains that sort of mixture of social and scientific data sets that overlap.
And when we go and look at the numbers on emissions, for example, we know that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are going up, and then you might have your numbers on emissions, and we might attempt to calculate whether or not those emissions turn up into the extra concentrations in the atmosphere. And do we see a big gap between those two numbers? Oksana, for example, is there a big discrepancy there between what happens in the atmosphere? Sorry?
Well, actually, we do, and this is pretty frustrating because we've been the regulation UNFCCC was signed, I don't know, like in 1992, and everybody know that the emissions are driving the climate change. And what we've done since we signed the agreement, we increase emissions by 80%. I mean, as if we don't know. So talking about social liabilities is like, it's not that we don't know that we need to reduce emissions. We know pretty well, and nevertheless, emissions are rising every year. And we also have seen cases when some of the companies, they wanted to look nice, they wanted to look green, and then instead of actually looking on revision of their management practices and revision of their business practices, they just go and buy carbon credits, and that just became like really very difficult issues. And also, you say that we can use atmospheric observation, and we can use what is possible to do with science to quantify the impact of the actions on the concentrations and on emissions. In reality, it's done by the self-reporting, and you can self-report whatever you want. It's not quantified with atmospheric measurements. There's so few companies who actually do want to see what they are doing, and there's so many companies who actually just go and buy carbon credits to declare carbon neutrality.
Actually, while I agree with everything I was told that I'm allowed to jump in if I may.
Go for it.
I completely agree with everything you said in a theoretical world. There is a theory of change that works here. So first of all, you're absolutely right. Emissions on scope 3 are 26 times. So the indirect emissions are 26 times what the direct emissions in scope 1 and 2 are together on average. And yet we see reporting of those, and even they're only in particular categories. So I look aside because I forget numbers, of only 42%, and that's been going up. You're absolutely right. that there isn't a sufficient element. There is, to be fair, the theory of change around social, it depends on a whole ecosystem, including science, to come and say, we are transparently doing this. We are attributed a certain level of accountability to that. Please invest in us because we are resilient, because we're doing that. Therefore, not doing so through self-reporting is actually a liability, is a risk in terms of legal accountability. And that is the slew of legislation that we have seen in the last 24 months around disclosure, which seems occasionally peripheral, is exactly around that. You have to say these things, you have to say them correctly. And if you don't say them correctly, you're liable by law. But that's following voluntary disclosure, which is you have to say these things because they show us you're a better company, therefore you are worth more. And if you are lying to us about those, then you are lying to us legally. Just to clarify that there is, other than that, there's also what I call the 20% of the angels, those who want to lead or at least given a pathway, which leads to those that didn't want to, understanding what the norm is, which forces those at the back to do the same. Sorry,
eventually
to cut
everybody's
in.
going to have to get in line, right, with all of the rules and regulations. But meanwhile, at the same time, we know that nature is changing because of the warming that's going on. And I wanted to bring up a graphic showing what's happening in the Amazon. We know that I think it was 2021, the Amazon was reported to have switched from becoming a carbon sink to a carbon source. And measurements continue to show that that's going on, some of it to do with clearing, burning, etc. Oksana, can you just quickly talk us through that one, what we can see here?
Yeah. So what you see on this plot is actually kind of the sites where the measurements of the vertical profile of greenhouse gases are performed, CO2 in particular. And what you can, well, actually, the number is not on this plot. Are these measurements at the sites has been performed for about 15 years. And we could see that if we look at the total budget of Amazon, like within the last 3 years, it was 0.5 gigaton of CO2 emissions. And I will get back to my question. People buy carbon credits from Amazon. And there is a notion like if the forest is there, following the current accounting practices, you go, you measure the tree. And if the tree is there, you calculate amount of biomass which is on the tree. But the tree is not the furniture. You know, you can actually estimate how much biomass is in your table. It does not take up anything, and it does not emit anything. Probably if your table gets old and starts decomposing, it will start producing emissions in the atmosphere. But the forest, they are living substances, so they are respirating. And then the temperature is increasing. They need to save water, so they stop photosynthetic activity, but they still release CO2 in the atmosphere. So basically, they are turning from the machine which pumps out CO2 from the atmosphere into a machine which actually puts CO2 back in the atmosphere. And there's a lot of biomass there.
There's let's bring in Richard on this. I mean, the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service is doing work on these sorts of things all of the time. I know you've also been looking at wildfires emissions, and we can bring up a wildfire emissions graph from May to September 2023. How are we able to quantify these numbers regarding emissions, for example, from fires or from degradation of forests?
So yes, this is carbon emissions from Canadian fires in this case, but similarly for the Amazon area, which is hugely important for well, it's a global ecosystem in terms of its massive forest, and yes, we do see change. So monitoring emissions from fires is actually relatively straightforward. There is always an uncertainty, but we have observations from satellites that basically detect the heat emitted from a fire. Or we can look at the burning scars of fires. So both methods complement each other, and we can then estimate emissions from those. There's emission factors in this as well.
You wouldn't count the number of trees that are burnt, but you would measure the number of burnt hectares and then make a calculation based on what you believe the density of trees to be, and then the amount of burning that's happened there.
Exactly, or purely the heat emitted by a burning forest. That's what we can actually detect by satellite. So we can estimate the emission within hours after observing this. And then
And are those quite accurate?
Those are quite accurate. Again, there's uncertainties, there's certain emission factors going in there, but it's accurate enough for what we need to use for. What we, for instance, do to verify is that we can use these emissions from fires in our global models that look at how, for instance, carbon monoxide or small particles, aerosols are transported around the world. And we can compare that again with all the satellite observations of these gases in the atmosphere or these particles in the atmosphere and see if this is correct. And we see that it is indeed correct. So we are within the uncertainty margins. We are really monitoring these emissions. And these can be
getting back to what we were talking about, kind of carbon credits and countries who are, for example, going to be going to climate negotiations in Azerbaijan, who are maybe looking at trying to sell, in inverted commas, their forests against credits, and then you've got these drying, you've got forest fires, etc. How on earth can that actually work and be credible as a system?
I think this. I'm not the expert in this area, to be honest, but I think it's something we have to be careful with. Even if you go through these simple programs that you can buy a tree in order to fly on an airplane, I think the truth is still out there, how well this can work and not work. What we are trying to do is really try to measure as best as we can, provide the data to monitor all these elements to see if it works or if it doesn't work. And that can be linked then to the more economical drivers of selling carbon credits related to these things. But it's important to have the right data there from as many different ways of observing the forest as we can.
And this is not just the Amazon or in Canada, for example. I can also bring up a graphic which shows us about CO2 uptake from European forests in 2022 when we had a big drought and there was a drop in the uptake from, and this is the forests around where I live, where you live as well. Oksana, this graphic's from you. Can you just quickly explain what we can see there?
Yeah. So you can see that usually during June, July, and August, when you have the summer season, you have a substantial uptake of CO2.
So that's the part on the left.
By the plants. Yeah. So and what you see, this red triangular, this is kind of the missing CO2 which has not been taken by the plants during the summer 2022. So you see that there is some additional CO2 which left in the atmosphere, which would traditionally has been taken during this growing season.
How does that mess things up as far as our calculations about our emissions are concerned, but also compared, when we've got countries and companies and regions, etc., who are trying to do a good job of presenting their work, then climate change comes along and slightly changes the figures or dramatically changes the figures?
Well, if I may comment, actually, this is not taken into consideration in climate models. If you look at the national commitments, most of our national determined contribution do rely on forests to meet their commitments, and there is a projection increased our uptake by the forest. If you look at the previous emission gap report, and impact of the let's say what they call a geoengineering or carbon dioxide removal techniques, majority of those techniques, they rely on increased uptake by the forest. And if this does not happen, and that's what we see in the atmosphere, if you have droughts, if you have extreme events, or if you have biomass burning, so you lose biomass or it is stress, so then the national commitments, they are kind of not very much reliable because they rely on the thing which we cannot characterize, which we cannot describe, which we do not actually study sufficiently. And then all the commitments,
which
like
is nature.
if you relied on if you relied last year on the carbon uptake by Canadian forest, woof, it's already in the air. It's not taking up anything. So then you have to actually adjust the national determined contribution and the commitments of the countries to actually reduce more on the side of emissions, because the uptakes are not working the way it is working. And the same may happen. We see it happening with a terrestrial biosphere. It may happen with the ocean as well, and we owe actually 50% reduction in our emissions just due to those uptakes. So if they are not happening, which means that we have to do a much better job in reducing emissions, physically reducing what we emit in the atmosphere, because the
but also
uptakes
doing
will
kind
not.
of calculations as we go as well, related to what we see actually happening in the natural world. You mentioned the United Nations Environment Programme's emissions gap report, which is coming out later this week, I believe, for fans of such things. It was a great report last year, very accessible, very easy to read, and basically it showed that we're on track for a temperature rise of about 2.5 to 2.9 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Basically that we need to, according to that report, from 2023, that we basically need to cut emissions by 28% by 2030 in order to be on track for 2 degrees of warming. So major efforts need to be made. Some of those can happen in industry, and I want to bring in Bram now, who's been very quiet, but you can talk to us a bit about methane and the work of the team in the Netherlands. You've been using a satellite called Sentinel 5P with an instrument called Tropomi on it, which allows us to observe methane. Can you just tell us a bit about it? And we'll bring up a graphic so everybody can see what it looks like.
Yeah, sure. And that's also with collaborators around the world that we're doing this kind of thing. So the idea is that we can actually observe the amount of methane in the atmosphere by looking at it from space. So we have the Tropomi instrument that's flying on Sentinel 5P, which is an ESA satellite. And what it does is that it looks at reflected sunlight. So the light comes from the sun, and then it travels through the atmosphere, and it's reflected by the surface, and then it goes up to the satellite. And along that light path, light at specific wavelengths or colors, is absorbed by, for example, methane molecules. And that way they kind of leave their fingerprint in the light that then reaches the detector. And by looking at how much light has been taken away, we can then estimate how much methane is present in the atmosphere. Now, with these different satellites, we can do that everywhere around the world to look at broad-scale concentrations. But with Tropomi, we now also for the first time get a global daily view of the largest emitters, because the individual observations of Tropomi cover an area of about 7 by 5.5 kilometers. And that allows us to detect individual methane plumes, which we now do on a daily basis, and it shows us these big emission hotspots around the world related to methane. And those are emissions from the oil and gas industry, but we also see emissions from coal mines as well as urban areas where you, for example, have big landfills where waste is decaying without oxygen, and that then also leads to big methane emissions.
We're just going to bring up an animation for those who don't spend their time thinking about space as much as you and I. This is the kind of orbit. So this is a polar orbit. How often does that fly over my head?
So it flies over your head once a day. So this is showing the animation for 24 hours. So we fly around the world 14 times, and then the world kind of rotates around under the satellite. And because we have a pretty big viewing angle, we're able to, with those observations, then cover the world on a daily basis.
I'm just going to bring up another graphic which you sent to us, which gives us those weekly overview of methane emissions. And that's quite an extraordinary thing to be able to do. How much action is taken on that data? Just talk us through what we can see here, and then, what is actually done with that information afterwards.
Yeah, so what you see here are the big plumes that we've detected in about a week's worth of data. So these are really the biggest methane plumes. So if there isn't a circle here, it doesn't mean there are no emissions. It just means that either it was cloudy or the emissions were too spread out to lead to big plumes that you can detect with Tropomi. Now, like I was saying, you see different source types here. You see, for example, coal mining emissions in China. You see oil and gas emissions, for example, in the United States in the Permian Basin. And you see a couple of big urban areas where we have, among other emissions, these emissions from landfills. Now,
so for
based on
example, all of that around the Caspian Sea, what's going on there? Is that emissions from oil and gas industry?
Yeah, for example, we see large emissions in Turkmenistan, and we have an example from a big emission in Kazakhstan to show you what these data look like. And it also illustrates that based on tropomi, it's often hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that was emitting, because within an area of 7 by 5.5 kilometers, you can have multiple facilities.
Of course,
That's why we combine tropomi with high resolution satellites that can zoom in. So we have an example where we zoomed in with Sentinel-2.
Yeah, we're going to bring that graphic up, and we should be able to see it. You can see how you identified it. Yeah, talk us through that.
Yeah, so on the left, we see the plume that we identified in tropomi. We actually use machine learning to automatically scan the data because tropomi takes millions of observations, so you don't want to go through all of these by hand. Then, of course, we do check them all manually. Now, on the right here, we zoomed in with Sentinel-2. And there are now more and more satellites that were meant to observe methane and can find emissions of about 100 kilograms an hour. Sentinel-2 is not one of those. Sentinel-2 is actually an Earth imager, so it's designed to observe the surface of the Earth. But because these emissions here are so big, we can still see this methane plume and then pinpoint to an accuracy of about 20 meters where those emissions are coming from. And here what we see is a big release from an oil and gas facility. And this is really a major plume. It's emitting at hundreds of tons an hour, just in one location. So you can imagine that the mitigation potential, especially if these are leaks that weren't known before, is really big. And that is why we are collaborating with IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And they have a methane alert response system that takes in satellite analysis, including what we do with tropomi, and then communicates those leaks to the responsible governments and companies so that these can be acted upon.
Do they take action behind that afterwards? Are there examples of people saying, oh, we didn't know about that methane leak, we better fix it?
Yeah, so IMEO has shared some of those examples. I think there are a lot of emissions still that we keep seeing, so I think there's more to be done there. But I think these data are relatively new, and we're seeing that they're becoming more and more relevant, and hopefully at some point we'll also start to see fewer of these plumes around the world on a daily basis.
Richard, did the goal be to have this on a much larger scale or on a finer scale? How would you like to see this develop?
Yes, we definitely want to see this further develop, and we are actually working on this within the Copernicus program. So we have Sentinel-5P already in orbit. We have Sentinel-5, which will be the follow-on in the planning for launch next year, and then the real ambition is a next satellite CO2M, CO2 monitoring mission, which will actually be a constellation of 3 satellites to basically provide as much global coverage as we can, while still being able to zoom into 2 by 2 kilometers. If you look at specific facilities, so CO2M will measure both CO2 and methane. So continue the work that Bram showed for methane, but we also want to see how we can use this mission to do the same thing for CO2, which is more complicated than methane. Methane has very clear plumes generally, while for CO2M it's more mixed with what we call the background variability of atmosphere concentration.
The principle is basically the same. You're going to be comparing measurements from the satellite that we can see here together with Earth imaging information in order to be able to find sources from cities or from big industrial plants or whatever.
Yes, exactly. So CO2M is really pushing the technology by combining very high spatial resolution. So we can, as I said, 2 by 2 kilometers focus, but also providing the global coverage. So we can do this worldwide on a daily basis, and then also use the data not just to look at individual facilities, but also looking more at regions, cities, countries, to monitor CO2 emissions as best as we can from satellite data.
I'm going to come to Amir soon, but ultimately, you as a scientist, how would you like to see that information used? And is this going to become the hot topic of COP in 2030 or 2032 or whatever? These kinds of pinpoint measurements that you will soon be able to make.
Yeah, for me, the first real aim we have with this is to provide scientific data that can be used for basically for consistency checking. We have reported emissions from many countries around the world. If you zoom in within the countries, you have facilities, etc., pipelines. Having a global view from satellite will provide you with a consistent view of the world every day, and also close to real time. So we have very up-to-date information to really feed back to the people who need to make decisions, who are looking after mitigation efforts, etc. So yes, the ambition is certainly to provide this data to be an important part of not just COP, but basically daily work on mitigation of climate change.
Amir, how
if I may
significant
chime
are
in,
these? Go on.
I think that bringing this into discussion with the policymakers, again, I will push us back and say that in some countries you still see the total fluxes, and the total fluxes are composed of the natural component and the anthropogenic component. So it will be important also to take actions to actually separate, and you can't see everything from satellite. Let's be pragmatic. There are areas, in particular, if you get to the forests or to the agricultural areas, or I don't know, the areas where you have climate feedbacks like polar latitudes, the satellites do not see in the darkness, and they do not see above the clouds, and many tropical forests are covered by the clouds. So we need to be pretty pragmatic what can be done and what cannot be done from the satellite system themselves. So we need actually to look to take like more integrated approach, combine satellite data with ground-based data, and get them all together and do the attribution. So just bringing the satellite observation and beautiful maps to the decision making is not very useful. You have to put a number and not just a beautiful picture.
They are nice pictures, but I'm guessing, though, I understand your point, Oksana, but surely it allows us to hit big emitters quickly, doesn't it? Amir, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I again have to agree with everything Oksana said. I think there are a few lags and gaps here. So in an ideal situation, I'll start from the end. In an ideal situation, we'd use tropomi and CO2M, for example. I'm saying we, but anyone who has voluntary tracking, rather than saying, I mean, in addition to saying, what are your emissions, which we verify now, that is a past-looking criteria. It doesn't really help to bring change. What we would start asking is, okay, you have access to, let's say, I know with the red telephone that comes from tropomi CO2M, what is the level of governance that you have that is associated with immediate action within your board to any message that comes to you either from your government or from whatever satellite agency? And it seems like a removed question, but actually what happens is then you have a piece of data that says, we have a senior management position that is constantly manned to respond to any tropomi messages, and we have an X amount of our funding associated with such things. And these things, whether voluntary or not, can be checked. And that provides us with a point of progress going forward. That's number one. Number two is to build on that in terms of data points. Science tells you what's happening now. It can predict theoretically what's happening in the future, but it's an evolving element of that works, that doesn't work, that works only if you do the following things, et cetera, et cetera. We have a little bit of that integrated into some of the conditions of what's called the Cancun safeguards. So you're talking about carbon credits. Cancun safeguards are for something called REDD+, to do with deforestation, reforestation. And one of the things that they demand for the use of anything to do with deforestation is something called permanence. And now there is, of course, additionality. Those are science-based criteria. And I'm going to double click on one of them and say, when we are going to, for example, something such as additionality, so the changing of the respiration of forests as a huge issue in their capacity, or the capacity of any sink to function. What we can monitor, what we can ask CDP or anyone else to whom reporting is happening is, are you taking that into account in association with the, AR6 or whatever methodology would be the latest? So the IPCC latest report, but any methodology that would be the latest, and you taking in that methodology is as far as we can use science. There's an interplay there. I don't trust companies, cities, states, and regions, not in terms of bad faith, but to have the scientific capacity to measure not only CO2, but the impacts of nature, right? Climate is one small part of the huge problem of biodiversity loss. And that is significantly more complicated. It's weird for the Global Director of Climate to say, but I am only a small part, and the Global Director of Nature is the one who has the truly hard job. And none of that can be predicted by satellite. It can be based on actions on satellites. There has to be a guidance with nature of these actions are useful. Let's measure these actions. Okay, those are the actions you as a company need to tell us that you're doing. Somebody else is going to check that you're indeed doing them. Then we're going to check the impact. Then we're going to tell you what you need to do the next time, that iterative relationship. It's not only policymakers. In many cases, it's investors that are, a policymaker is a huge hammer. A law is a hammer. It crushes. Investment, things like that, they're a surgeon's knife, and they're much more agile to, we've just discovered this practice is terrible. Please stop doing it. It takes much less time than legislation. Sorry, I'll pause here with my tangent of going on and answering.
No, it's interesting because we gather all of this information and then you need to do something with it. Bram, I'd like to hear your vision as a scientist about how you'd like this to develop and these observations, and how you'd like them to be used by decision makers.
Yeah, so I think there are multiple use cases. I think the easiest one is, we detect a big leak, somebody should act upon it. I think the other one is tracking emissions overall, where, it's not just the satellites. You want to combine it with observations on the ground, but, you can't measure everywhere at the same time. That's the advantage of the satellite. It gives us a global, consistent picture. That way you then combine it with additional observations on the ground, you get the best idea of emissions. And then the important next step is to combine and integrate it with these emissions that are calculated using, those calculations where you say, okay, I have activity data, I have emissions factors. Those you want to combine with the observations and make sure that your calculations are consistent with what you're seeing in the atmosphere. Because that then also allows you to see what happens if you change different things within your emission system. You want to be able to also model your emissions from your landfill to see, okay, how am I now going to change what I see with the satellite?
It gets into a very, very complicated business. And at the end of the day, the change is rapid. We are facing very rapid warming, as we started out saying at the beginning. Can we actually, Richard, can we get to the point where we can actually get actionable, useful data into the system in order to start driving down emissions, as that emissions gap report was saying needs to happen? Can we get that on the table quickly so that companies, regions, national governments, international organizations, etc., can start taking serious action quickly and get that emissions number down?
Yes, I think so. And we're actually doing this already. I mean, you're absolutely right that it's a complex system, especially if we look at CO2. It is many factors playing a role, but for methane, it's similar with, for instance, wetlands playing a large role if you look at the global methane budget. So it's complex. We need to throw all our science and technology at it, as we are doing. It's really pushing the boundaries, but also taking it step by step. And for instance, the results that Bram showed with the methane monitoring based on satellites is already one of those steps. And it's actually providing very useful information to feedback to companies, to countries to deal with this. And also given that for instance, regulations in many parts of the world on methane are becoming stricter, they can only be enforced if there is sufficient data to really monitor this. For CO2, it will take a few more years to really get to a similar maturity level, but there also we are doing things that are helping. And as Oksana said, it's really looking at it from an integrated approach. It's not just satellites, it's also ground-based observations, but also using
But
other
aren't there
data.
sort of huge gaps in our knowledge around the tropical areas of the planet, the remote areas of the planet? Surely there are huge gaps there. We don't really know what's going on.
Yes,
we
there
don't
are
know what
huge.
is going on with we don't know what is going on with the oceans. We know that only 3% of ocean is being observed. And that is an area where 25% of emissions are being taken up. So it's, yeah, we know very little
Is,
actually about
there
climate
is
system.
there any fix for that? Do any of these satellite missions help us to improve that situation? Richard?
They will, yes, and to support Oksana here as well, also trying to get more ground-based data as well over oceans, more buoys that can measure directly, more ships that can measure directly, but satellites as well. It's a combination of things to really advance our understanding of what's going on. And as we referred to earlier, it's important because we assume at the moment that a significant part of our fossil fuel emissions is being absorbed by the land surface and the marine environment. And if this changes, we need to be aware, and we need to even work harder
And we feel like it's changing now, right?
It is changing now. Yes, we see some signs, but we need to better understand them, better quantify them. And there's a lot of science being directed at this to really look into more details. But science also needs the data.
Let's have a quick look at the longer term perspective and go back to a graph which brings us back to really where we started, which is the situation of our planet at the moment, which is that we continue to be warming since the pre-industrial era, where last month was 1.7 degrees above the pre-industrial average. When you look at this, we can expect a even sharper rise in that curve, I'm guessing, before we start to see any real action taken towards reducing emissions. At least that's my expectation. What do you think, Oksana?
Well, we should not take one particular month or one particular year into, let's say, as a guiding number, because there's a lot of variability. You can see the plot goes up and down, and that's variability is driven by natural processes. So if you have phenomena like El Nino or La Nina, they can impact your global temperature. But if we look at the trend, it's not very promising. But also looking at the global concentration, we see that the global concentration are increasing, but we also see similar wiggles up and down in the growth rate. In the increase can change from year to year, so we need to look at the general trend. The trend is not promising, and it's actually pretty depressive to look at the trends in the global concentration. The increase, I mean, if we look at the last 10 years,
we expect the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, to go up again this year, right?
Yes, we do.
423 parts per million.
We could be somewhere around, on a global average, somewhere around 420 or around that number. I mean, the average increase is 2.4 within last 10 years, because we also had very strong El Nino in 2016, which actually drove the growth rate up. But I
want to conclude with an animation that Richard sent to me, which is rather mesmerizing to look at, and it's basically shows CO2 emissions over the course of a whole year, over the process of 12 months. Richard, can you talk us through what we can see going on here with all those different swirly colors?
Yes, so this is basically illustrating how complex the problem is we're facing. So this is something that the satellite would see. These are 3 hourly variations throughout the year of atmospheric concentrations of CO2, with high concentrations in red, low concentrations in green, and you can clearly show the impact of vegetation. You actually see a little bit of a pulse, especially in the tropics. So
we're in
both
springtime here, right? I can see it getting to the May and June coming up.
Yeah, so now
So-
you can see that vegetation kicks in, photosynthesis kicks in the northern hemisphere, and CO2 is removed. So you see the red disappearing and more green and blue appearing. So this is clearly this late spring, summertime in the northern hemisphere. You see that in the tropics we have during this time of the year the highest concentrations. You also see the signals of individual large emitting sources. And fires, for instance, now if you look at South America, you see the impact of fires on the atmospheric concentrations. Also over Africa, where there's still massive biomass burning happening in different periods of the year. So you see all these things combining, both the human-controlled emissions as well as the natural effects. And
then what's
our
happening over
task
China?
is-
That's industrial activity, is it? The red that we could see swirling around China, that's industrial activity?
For the most part, it's never a single source, but yes, over that area there's a lot of emissions from industrial activities. But again, this is really what we're trying to do with these new generation satellites, with the in-situ observations, and actually with the models that are used to make these simulations. We need to relate what we measure to the underlying emissions and distinct between what's natural, what is anthropogenic. And even anthropogenic is complex because any managed land is anthropogenic. So a forest that's managed is anthropogenic emissions. While if you look at other areas of the world, it might be purely natural and therefore being in a different category. And our task is to separate this, provide the data in the clearest way to the people who are making the decisions and who are trying to mitigate.
Good luck with it. It looks incredibly difficult to do that.
It is difficult, but that's what makes it really great to work with. I mean, we're putting ourselves a challenge, and we know it's important. We need better data to really monitor the impact of mitigation efforts. So for me, it's a joy to work in this area.
Do you think it could, just to conclude, because we need to wind up, but do you think that much better emissions monitoring could really change politics? Because let's say at the moment, do you really even need to know? We all know that we need to get to net zero. How much more data do you need in order to know that you need to get to net zero? But do you think this kind of measuring and the kind of attribution that Amir was talking about could change world politics, could end up meaning people review particular agreements, or there's a major shift in terms of power?
May I?
Well, I'll come to you, Amir. Let's hear Richard on that one.
Okay, I'll keep it short then. I think it will. Part of it is already making it visual, trying to show what the problem is and why this is needed, and this can be in different ways. But this is part of making it visual to a much larger audience than people in the policy area. So for me, that's already very important. Having more and better independent, accurate data will definitely have a major effect, and we already see this with methane. We have also seen it in the past with air quality monitoring. So yes, I'm a strong believer that this will help to change the world to a better way.
Amir?
I very much believe it will help, but not in the way that we're discussing here. I think that by the time this data comes in, we have to practice something called the precautionary principle that comes from conservation. So you were talking about the monitoring of the ocean, which is one of the biggest sinks in the world. About 64% of the planet is not monitored by any government, any policymaker, which is areas beyond national jurisdiction. The monitoring system on them, called IDLOS, is never mind, but we need to practice with our companies in order to take this and make it practical. There has to be an iterative process with science. These are the actions you need to take. I'm not a scientist, but presumably science will tell you if those have worked, and then we will tell you what the next actions are. But it's more a question of a precautionary principle where there is no universe. There is no universe in which every corporate, every city, every state, and even every country in the world has the capacity to respond to immediate scientific data coming in. There's always going to be a lag of between 1 to 2 years, let's say 6 months, in an unbelievably advanced situation. But we still have to take action right now. So what the most important part in terms of science is to find that the strongest link between the social accountability, you, company X, are responsible for these Y emissions as they go along, and here are the actions you need to take. I'm not asking you to measure the impact. Here, science will measure the impact, and you will get the finance to act in accordance with science. That's as fast as I can say it without stumbling over words.
Let me bring in Bram, your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think the data can absolutely help. I think in the end, the decision to reduce emissions doesn't need to further rely on these data. It's clear what we need to do in terms of reducing emissions, but I think we can support the case by providing better data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose getting down to pinpointing locations, the more and more precise you can be with your satellite data, the better that's going to be, particularly when it comes to these emissions from industrial areas, as you were talking about. Oksana, how much do you think, I mean, I know you move in circles of international organizations as well. You're from the WMO, you're currently on a bit of a tour of Asia. People in other parts of the world outside Europe where we care about emissions, we talk about it a lot, are people in other parts of the world that you encounter interested in this kind of information, keen on taking action on it?
Well, the interesting thing is that I was last week at the meeting in China where we were looking at the scientific methodologies to understand the sequestration capacity of bamboo forests. So people are interested to better have characterization. Maybe not for the right reason, because they are looking at that like how much carbon credits we can sell. but in general, there is an information. But what is happening is that at the level of businesses, there are some companies who want to take action. They are not aware of this is possible or that these data are available. So I think that is important to build a partnership so that actually the data can be used, because we produce a lot of scientific information, and majority of the companies are not aware that it is possible actually to quantify emissions using observations. They just use the GAG protocol to do the reporting, and they're not aware that actually you can put up two sides, upwind, downwind, and you can see your facility and what you do at it.
Fascinating. You're right. Yeah. Well, more data needed, but action is urgently needed. And we'll be talking about this more on Euronews over the coming weeks as we cover the COP summit. Please head over to euronews.com, download the app, find out a lot more information about climate change, and head over to Euronews Green for special information there, reporting about sustainability and green issues in general. My thanks to the panelists, Richard Engelin from the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. Fantastic to have you there. Bram Massakers from the Netherlands Institute for Space Research, Oksana Tarasova from the World Meteorological Organization, and Amir Sokolovsky from CDP. Thanks very much for being with us on this panel. Please head over to euronews.com/climate now for more information about how our planet is changing, and I'll see you soon.